While the structures of the modern church for theological debates have their problems, today's church does not face the crisis of authority that the early church did after the death of the apostles. The early church sought to cure these problems by 1. Seeking to organize the writings of the apostles into a canon, 2. To establish relative authority through the idea of apostolic succession, and finally, work to advocate between different opinions by establishing a clearer church hierarchy. So, as the church grew, heresies began to pop up. This led the church to compile a list of writings and books that had authority on theology and those that didn't. One of these heretics was Marcion from AD 85 to 160 AD. And he bought his way into the bishop of Rome with a huge donation of over 200,000 sesterces, which was a huge amount of money back in the day. And he basically believed that the God in the Old Testament was actually Satan and not actually Yahweh. And Marcion believed that the Old Testament was incompatible with the New Testament, as there were two very different messages, he thought, coming from the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. And one of the examples that Marcion and his followers gives is a story where in 2 Samuel it says that God incited David to take a census, which was a sin back in the Old Testament. But in 1 Chronicles it says that Satan incited David to take the census. And therefore, Marcion and his followers said that therefore Yahweh in the Old Testament is actually Satan, and Jesus is actually its own separate thing and separate from the God of the Old Testament. And the church wasn't very happy about this. And so they had to establish which books had authority on theology and which ones didn't. Because, of course, Marcion took the books out that he didn't like, including all of the Old Testament and Matthew and Mark. And so, they made their own list of canon that we roughly use to this day. And this clarified the views of the church and led to them more easily rooting out heresies. And this really all started with the Marcionian heresy, as Robert M. Grant says, quote, Marcion forced more Orthodox Christians to examine their own presuppositions and to state more clearly what they already believe. So because of some of the heresies popping up, it forced the church to establish a canon list on which books have authority on theology and which ones didn't. Therefore, putting in place a system of books that had authority and which ones didn't for the Christian church. Secondly, with most and later all of the apostles dead, the question that arose was who had the final say in the church. And so the idea of apostolic succession arose to answer that question on who had the final and greatest authority in the church. And this question of authority really only rose after the disciples and apostles died, because they were with Jesus. So if someone had a question on what did Jesus meant when he said this, the apostles could say, oh, I was with him when he said that, and he explained to me later what it meant, and this is what it means. But after they died, they couldn't do that. So they came up with the idea of apostolic succession, which is the teaching that bishops represent a direct, uninterrupted line of continuity from the apostles of Jesus Christ, and that basically you become a successor of the apostles by being baptized by them and being born again through them. And this isn't actually the newest of ideas. It actually has its roots in Greco-Roman and Hebrew culture, where both viewed the son receiving an inheritance as more than just a transfer of wealth from the older to the younger generation, but actually saw the successor as the embodiment of their ancestor. So, like, Bob's son is actually, like, when Bob's father dies, Bob becomes the embodiment of his father. And so this was roughly the same idea with apostolic succession, except it wasn't through biological lineage, but through baptism. Like if you were baptized by Paul, you would be the rightful successor to the bishopship by being the spiritual embodiment of Paul. And people supported this idea, including the de facto first pope, Clement, who, when speaking about the apostles, said, quote, "Afterwards they added the further provision that if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry." The approved men, of course, being the people that the apostles, had baptized and appointed as leaders of their churches. And so, finally, as the church grew, in order to maintain a more united faith and to establish a clearer sense of the Orthodox doctrine, deacons and clergy began to emerge, and later into a clearer hierarchy of authority. So the deacons began to emerge as the churches grew in cities, where the deacons would go from church to church, explaining like new ideas about theology to other churches that another church had. They were basically communicators between churches of a certain area. And as the church grew, it obviously became harder for one person to do it. So obviously more people became deacons, and then there were people organizing the deacons, and that role landed mostly on the bishops after a while. And as the churches grew and grew, they began to communicate more between each other, which meant that a more unified idea on how the church should worship and what the church should do began to emerge. And like garments and that sort of things started to become standardized in the 2nd century because of this hierarchy. And the deaconhood and priesthood began to emerge as its own class over the congregation, as they had a more important job of spreading information between congregations. So a clear hierarchy began to emerge as the congregations at the bottom, and then the deacons, and then the bishops over them. And your rank as a bishop depended on how wealthy and the city you are over. So if you're over just an unimportant town in rural Rome, then you wouldn't have that much prestige. But if you were like in a big city like Antioch or Rome, then you had much more prestige and more authority. And so this is the idea of popehood or popery, where the most important things rose up through the ranks of the church, and eventually would come to the bishop in Rome. And this included like theological arguments. Like if you lost a theological argument on the lower level, you can appeal to a higher level and eventually to the bishop in Rome, as stated in the Council of Sardica. Quote, "Let us honor the memory of the Apostle Peter by having those who have given the judgment write to Julius, Bishop of Rome, so that if it seem proper, he may himself send arbiters and the judgment may be made again." And this is talking about a bishop who lost a debate, that they can appeal to the Bishop of Rome, which at the time was Julius. And so, there was a very clear hierarchy that emerged, and therefore the higher you were up the hierarchy, the more authority and prestige you had. So, fine. So while the structures for the modern church and for its theological debates have their problems, today's church does not face the crisis of authority as the early church did after the death of the apostles. And the church sought to remedy these by organizing the writings of the apostles into a canon, to establish relative authority through the idea of apostolic succession, and finally to educate between different opinions by establishing a church hierarchy. Thank you.